The street on which the Morgan house stood was buried in greenery, lined with tall trees with dense crowns. George had always loved this part of town. Quiet, far from the noise, it seemed to have been specially created for family life. He and Alice had lived here for 10 years, and although their relationship was far from perfect, George always found a way to maintain the illusion of harmony. Alice, his wife, was a beautiful woman, the kind of woman who was always ready to put the needs of others first. Her soft features, warm smile, and attentive gaze gave the impression of a woman who knew how to listen and support. She was kind, but in George's opinion, sometimes too naive. They had been through a lot together, ups and downs, quarrels, and reconciliations. Recently, however, he began to feel distant from her. Every Thursday, Carola, Alice's mother, came to visit for dinner. She was the opposite of her daughter. Energetic, confident, with a strong charisma that was hard to ignore. Carola retained her beauty and charm despite her age. A widow for 10 years, she visited their home more often after her husband's death. There had always been a strong understanding between her and Alice, which George thought was almost perfect, until he began to perceive Carola differently. The first hints of his new perception appeared only recently. In the moments when he made eye contact with Carola, George began to notice her playful smile that communicated more than words. Her touches weren't really casual. They were light, barely noticeable, but they left a mark. He couldn't take his eyes off her, and she seemed to know perfectly well about his new feelings, but said nothing. That evening, when Carola came to dinner again, the atmosphere at the table was tense. Alice, as always, carefully set the table, trying to create a pleasant atmosphere. She had prepared her signature veal stew, which Carola always praised. But George was too absorbed in his thoughts to really enjoy his meal. Carola, comfortably seated in her chair, made small talk that only increased the tension for George. She was wearing an elegant dress that emphasized her figure. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose hairstyle that only emphasized her natural attractiveness. "Do you think we should get a new car, George?" Alice asked, interrupting his thoughts. Her voice had the genuine concern that had once attracted him so much, but now sounded like a reminder of his responsibilities. "What? A car?" He blinked a few times, trying to collect himself. "Yes, of course, darling. That would be nice. I already told Carola that we were looking at new models. She said she knew someone who might be able to help with a discount." "Oh, great," George replied dryly, though his mind was still somewhere between her holding the wineglass and gently fixing her hair. His admiration for Alice's mother only grew. Carola, feeling his gaze, looked up, their eyes met, and she smiled, tilting her head slightly. "George, you seem distant today," Carola said, clearly enjoying her effect on him. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything is fine," he replied, trying to hide his embarrassment. Alice gave him a brief but intense glance. She didn't say anything, but her eyes flashed with doubt. A few days later, Alice received an invitation to a charity party organized by their close friends, the Brown family. The Browns were frequent guests at the Morgan home, and their friendship with Alice stretched back to their childhood. "It'll be a great opportunity to unwind a little," Alice said as she sat next to George on the couch. She was holding the invitation in her hands and reading it carefully, trying to convince herself that it would be a nice event. "Sure," George replied, although he was not really looking forward to attending such events. But he knew that Carola would be there, and that changed his mood a little. "Carola will be there too," Alice added, as if she could guess his thoughts. She hadn't suspected anything yet, but something inside her was beginning to raise doubts. Her intuition, though not formed into clear suspicions, gave her the feeling that there was something in the relationship between her husband and her mother that she was not seeing. The party was held at the Browns' large estate, with spacious rooms filled with light and the sound of conversation. George, dressed in his best suit, felt a little awkward in the crowd. He knew almost everyone there, but he felt that this place belonged more to Alice. She was making small talk, laughing with her friends, and he was looking for only one person. Carola appeared a little later, dressed in a ruby-colored dress that emphasized her elegance. She moved between the guests easily and naturally, attracting attention. George was standing by the drinks table when he saw her. "George, it's good to see you here," she said, smiling, her eyes as penetrating as ever. "And it's good to see you too, Carola," he replied, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. Their exchange of glances was so obvious that others could have easily noticed. But this particular moment was a moment of agreement. No words, no unnecessary movements, just a silent understanding. From that moment on, George could no longer ignore his feelings. Chapter 2. Asterisk. Asterisk. Undercurrents. Asterisk. Asterisk. A few weeks passed since the party at the Browns' house, and George became more and more distant with each passing day. The things that had once attracted him to Alice, her caring, her kindness, her calmness, now seemed obsessive. She no longer aroused his interest or admiration. Conversely, Carola, with her free, playful nature, filled his thoughts more and more. Her presence became a need for him, and their brief encounters turned into a dangerous game that he could no longer ignore. It all started with innocent chance encounters. They crossed paths on the street or in stores, exchanging brief greetings. But over time, these meetings became more regular. Carola was a master at organizing accidents, and George got involved, not realizing that she was feeding his passion for a reason. His heart was beating fast because he realized that their meeting would no longer be a coincidence. He knocked on the door, and after a few seconds she opened it as if she knew he was coming. "George," Carola said, a slight look of surprise on her face, but with an expression as if she had been expecting him. "Is something wrong?" "I was just passing by and thought I'd drop by," he replied, trying to look casual. She smiled, inviting him inside. "Well, come in. I was just making myself some coffee. Would you like to join me?" They sat down in the kitchen. The spacious room was comfortably furnished. Carola always had impeccable taste. The kitchen table was covered with a white tablecloth with various small things on it, a jar of sugar, cups, and a small bottle of medicine. George noticed it when Carola put the cup in front of him. "What is that?" he asked, pointing to the bottle. "Oh, it's just a sedative," Carola replied casually. "Sometimes I take it when I feel nervous. You probably want to take something like that sometimes to relax too, right?" She said it with a laugh, and George just nodded in response, trying to concentrate on the coffee, but the bottle remained in his mind. "How is Alice feeling?" Carola suddenly asked, as if to change the subject, but with a hint of irony in her voice. "Fine, as usual," he answered dryly, but then added, "Although lately our relationship has become more complicated. She's always worrying about some little thing, and I don't feel like she really understands me." Carola moved closer, her eyes shining with interest. "Oh, George, that's not surprising. You've been together so long. Sometimes, even in the strongest marriages, there comes a time when people just lose each other. It's not your fault." Her words were calm, almost gentle. She leaned closer and their eyes met. "Maybe you deserve better than that. You are an extraordinary man, George. You deserve to be with someone who truly appreciates you, who truly understands that you are worth more than that." These words hit him like an explosion. George felt it was hard to breathe. He realized that he would not be able to return to his normal life. At home, his relationship with Alice was rapidly deteriorating. She could feel George's distance, but she couldn't understand what was going on. Their usual evenings together became tense. She tried to talk to him, but he answered in short phrases and avoided long conversations. His concern became automatic, as did his presence in their home. One evening, while they were eating dinner in the kitchen, Alice tried to start a conversation. "George, I feel like you've been a little distant lately. What's going on?" He looked at her, and irritation flashed through his eyes. He didn't want to talk about it, especially not with her. "It's nothing, Alice. It's just a lot of work," he answered briefly, and turned back to his plate. "Maybe we could spend a little more time together? I think we've started to drift apart." She wanted to add something else, but George abruptly put his fork down on the table and looked at her. "Maybe you're just exaggerating." His voice was sharp, almost cold. "Just give me some space." Alice felt her eyes fill with tears, but she just nodded and continued to eat in silence. Her intuition told her that something was wrong, but she had no idea what it was. Meanwhile, Carola was constantly encouraging George, as if looking for moments when he was particularly distraught. She knew just the right way to support him, with a simple conversation or even a light touch. Every time he felt nervous or disappointed with Alice, Carola was there to tell him that it was okay, that he deserved better. "Alice will never be able to understand you the way I do," she would say softly, and these words fed his ego. She skillfully manipulated him, gradually leading him to believe that his relationship with Alice was doomed, and her own closeness to him, her understanding, was the only salvation. Their meetings became more regular. George was no longer afraid to come to her house, and Carola found excuses to distract him from his family problems. They drank coffee, talked about life, and it always ended with her gently pushing him to think that his future could be different. One day, Carola took a bold step. They were sitting in her living room when she said quietly, "What if things were different, George? What if you didn't have to live in that tension with Alice anymore?" George looked at her in disbelief, but her eyes were serious. "What do you mean?" "I mean that maybe you've already made your decision. Maybe you just need to make up your mind." He remained silent, but her words began to sink in. The idea began to seem less out of reach. George and Alice's marriage, which had seemed to be a model of harmony just a few months ago, was gradually becoming broken. Alice felt a cold wall between them, invisible but impenetrable. Every attempt they made to talk turned into a formal exchange of remarks, and their evenings together lost their warmth. Alice saw George avoiding any intimacy, his gaze becoming blank when she tried to talk about their feelings. She no longer recognized him, the man she once loved with all her heart. Her heart broke at the thought that he might have found someone else. But what scared her even more was the unknown. What if it was all just her imagination? One evening, after several days of heavy, silent dinners, Alice could not take it anymore. She decided to try to save their relationship. Putting her plate aside, she looked directly into George's eyes. "We need to talk, George. I can't live like this anymore." "What do you want to talk about?" His voice was quiet and cold, almost mechanical. "About our marriage. You've changed, and I want to know why. If there's something you're not telling me, tell me now." George remained silent, his hand trembling slightly as he set his glass on the table. "I don't know what you want to hear, Alice. It's okay, I've just been busy lately. It's work, you know." "It's not work," Alice interrupted him, trying to remain calm, but her voice was already full of anxiety. "I feel like you treat me like a stranger. You're never home. You don't talk to me. George, please, just tell me the truth." He remained silent for a few more seconds, his jaw clenched as if he was trying to hold back something important. Finally, he stood up and said abruptly, "I'm just tired, Alice. From all this. Of our endless conversations and your constant control. You always want more, and I can't take it anymore. Give me some space." And without waiting for an answer, he left the room, leaving her sitting in complete silence. Alice felt her world slowly crumbling. She tried to hold back the tears, but they flowed down her cheeks, burning her skin. She didn't need any more words. She realized she was losing George, but she didn't know how to get him back. Meanwhile, the relationship between George and Carola was reaching new heights. Carola felt like a winner. She skillfully manipulated George, whispering compliments to him, encouraging him every time he mentioned Alice. Her cold, calculated actions encouraged him to drift even further away from his wife. "You deserve better, George," she said during one of their meetings. "Alice just doesn't realize how wonderful you are. But I see it in you. I see something she will never be able to appreciate." Carola no longer tried to hide her intentions. She knew George was ready for a change, and now it was just a matter of time. The night before their anniversary party, Alice tried to convince herself that there was still a chance for salvation. She believed that this party was an opportunity to make things right, to show George that she was willing to fight for their marriage. She spent several hours getting ready. She carefully chose her outfit, did her hair and makeup, but when she looked in the mirror, all she could see was tiredness in her eyes. The party was organized in a large country club, where all their friends were invited. The music was blaring, the champagne was flowing, but Alice felt like a stranger among these people. Her eyes were constantly looking for George, but he was somewhere in the background, always next to Carola. Every time their eyes crossed, Alice felt uncomfortable. Her suspicions only grew stronger, even though there was no evidence of infidelity. She tried to put these thoughts aside, but something about George's behavior made her think about it constantly. During dinner, Carola sat on the other side of the table, and her eyes often drifted to George's. Their chemistry was so obvious that even a few friends exchanged hints and ironic smiles. Alice tried to ignore it, but anger was brewing inside her. When dessert was served, Alice suddenly felt sick. First, it was a slight dizziness, then a sharp pain in her stomach. She decided to go outside for some fresh air, but when she stood up, her legs gave out. George, who was sitting next to her, grabbed her arm. "Alice, what's wrong? Are you sick?" His voice was tense, but more surprised than concerned. I don't know," she replied, holding her stomach. Her face turned white, and she suddenly felt weakness wash over her. Her eyes met Carola's for a moment, who was sitting calmly, showing no emotion. Her friends started to get up from the table, but it all looked chaotic. Someone called an ambulance, but Alice was no longer responding. Her body fell limply into the chair, and George, grabbing her, tried to bring her to life. "She's not breathing!" someone shouted, and the room suddenly became quiet. Carola stood aside, watching the panic around her, keeping her cool. Everything was going as she had planned. When the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Alice did not respond to any attempts by the doctors. Her death looked like an accident, and although most of the people present were in shock, Carola stood silently looking at George. There was more peace than anxiety in her eyes. Alice's death seemed like an accident to everyone. The doctors assumed that it was poisoning due to improper food consumption or some kind of allergic reaction, although Alice had never complained of such problems. George looked devastated, although he had a feeling inside him that his life could now change forever. Now that Alice was gone, the way to Carola was open. But what George didn't know was that Carola had much more complicated plans for their future together. Alice Morgan's death came as a shock to everyone who knew this friendly and charming woman. Family, friends, neighbors. Everyone was stunned by her sudden and tragic departure. Her death looked like an accident caused by poisoning or an allergic reaction. But the next morning, detectives showed up at their doorstep. The police had received the results of the initial tests, and something in those results led law enforcement to launch a more thorough investigation. Detectives Marcus Jackson and Tracy Brown were assigned to the case. Marcus, experienced and always discreet, had been involved in similar investigations many times before, but his intuition told him that this case might be special. Tracy, on the other hand, had been his partner for several years, and although she had less experience, her attention to detail had helped him solve crimes that others had missed. They both sensed that there was something strange about this case, something that defied easy explanation. Marcus and Tracy stood at the entrance to the house, watching its gloomy silence. They already knew the basic facts. Alice Morgan had died during a party in honor of her anniversary with George, her husband. The cause of death remained undetermined, but poisoning seemed the most likely option. They knew they had to start by gathering evidence and facts, but each of them realized that these facts might not immediately point to the truth. "Okay, let's start with George," Marcus said as he walked up the porch and knocked on the door. "I want to know how he feels about this." George Morgan opened the door almost immediately. He looked exhausted and devastated. His eyes were red with tears, but his face seemed too composed for a man who had recently lost his wife. "Detectives," he greeted, trying to stay calm. "I don't know how I can help you, but you can ask anything you need." Marcus and Tracy went into the house, which was still quiet after the tragic events. Their first questions were standard. What happened at the party? When exactly Alice started to feel sick? Who was there? George tried to answer as clearly as he could, but with each new question, more and more tension arose in his answer. Alice started complaining of a stomachache after we had lunch. I don't know what could have been wrong. We had the usual menu. She tried some dessert, and even then she seemed weak. "You mentioned that she had been fine before that?" Tracy clarified. "Yes, we had a normal evening. Well, as normal as we could have." George was silent for a second, as if he was surprised by his own words. "What do you mean?" Detective Jackson raised his eyebrows in interest. "We've been having some problems lately," George stuttered. "I don't want to reveal it, but our marriage hasn't been perfect. We had our conflicts, but I never meant her any harm. You have to understand that. We don't blame you, George, Marcus said calmly. But we need to understand the whole context. We need to figure out if her death could have been an accident or if something else could have contributed to it. After talking to George, the detectives decided to talk to Carola James, Alice's mother. She was at George's house. Carola met them at her home, and at first glance she seemed deeply saddened by the loss of her daughter. Her eyes were teary, but her face gave off a strange calmness. Alice was everything to me, she said in a quiet, reserved voice. I can't imagine my life without her. This loss, it has destroyed me. Marcus noticed the way she said these words with a certain automaticity, and although her voice was heartfelt, something in her expression made him doubtful. Were you at the party? Tracy asked, noticing the slight tremor in Carola's hands. Yes, of course, Carola replied. It was horrible. I will never forget watching my daughter fall right in front of me, but there was nothing I could do. I just stood there and watched. And how are you and George? Marcus asked cautiously, watching her reaction. We get along well. Carola was a little surprised, as if she hadn't expected such a question. George has always been a good husband to Alice, even though they've had some difficulties lately. But who doesn't have problems in their marriage, right? True, Marcus agreed, but he thought Carola was hiding something. Her tone was too even, too controlled. He glanced over to the living room table, where a small bottle of medicine was sitting. Do you take this medicine? Marcus asked, nodding at the bottle. Carola instantly tensed, though her face showed no emotion. It's George's medicine. I don't know what it's for. Marcus moved closer to the table and picked up the bottle. Do you mind if we take this for analysis? It's just standard procedure. You'll have to ask George. It's his medicine. I never thought it would make a difference. I don't think he'd mind. Marcus silently put the vial in his bag, sensing that this could be a key element in the investigation. He could see the fear in Carola's eyes. The detective spent several more days talking to family friends who had been at the party. Some witnesses recalled strange behavior between George and Carola, but no one could provide clear evidence that there was anything more than a friendly relationship between them. They always seemed close, said one of Alice's friends. But, they're mother and son-in-law. Maybe I'm just imagining things. I've noticed the looks too, added another friend, but I don't think it's anything serious. Marcus and Tracy continued to look for answers, but so far all the clues were just hints at a possible mystery. The investigation into Alice Morgan's death had entered its culminating phase. After weeks of interrogations, alibi checks, and analysis of the evidence collected, detectives Marcus Jackson and Tracy Brown were left with a blurred but almost complete picture of what had happened. Suspicion was growing around George and Carol, but definitive proof was still lacking. A decisive step was needed. Marcus sat in his office, mulling over all the facts he had found. He flipped through the recordings of the conversations, observing the thin, subtle threads that connected George and Carola. Their responses were coherent and careful, but sometimes too synchronized as if they had agreed on everything in advance. However, there was no direct evidence that the murder was premeditated. The bottle of medicine found in George's house had already become a central element of the case. The results of laboratory tests confirmed that the medicine contained a dangerous substance that could cause serious health problems, including death, if taken with alcohol. Although George claimed that she had only used the drug to calm herself down, it was clear that it could have been slipped into Alice's drink during the party. This was the first real breakthrough in the case, but it was not enough to secure a final conviction. Meanwhile, Tracy was reviewing the surveillance footage in and around the house. George and Carola always appeared on the video a few minutes apart, never at the same time, but their routes constantly intersected in the most unlikely places. It seemed suspicious. They're very careful, Tracy said, addressing Marcus. I don't believe it's a coincidence. Their paths keep crossing, and each time in different parts of the house where no one could see them. It's as if they were deliberately avoiding meeting in front of others, but secretly keeping in touch. Marcus nodded, deep in thought. At that moment, he realized it was time to go all in. We should get them both in the same place and see how they behave, Marcus said, leaning against the table. The next day, Marcus and Tracy summoned Carola and George for a formal interrogation. At first, they called them in separately, asking them standard questions, but after an hour, they decided to put them in the same room to see how they would react to each other. It was an important test. "We found out something important," Marcus began, watching George and Carola sit down next to each other. "There are things that unite you more than just Alice's death." George became nervous. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he tried to clench them into fists to hide his tension. Carola, on the other hand, seemed completely calm. Her cold confidence hadn't disappeared, and that was even more disturbing. "We've conducted a thorough investigation and have concluded that Alice's death was not an accident," Marcus continued. "Laboratory tests have shown that there were traces of a poisonous substance in her system, the same one we found in your house, George." "That's a mistake," George exclaimed, rising abruptly from his chair. His face suddenly flushed red. He tried to give Carola a quick glance, but held back. "You can't prove anything." Carola just gave George a quick glance, then smiled as if it were all just a game to her. "I don't know what you're trying to impute to me," Carola said coldly. "It's just a coincidence. I used that medicine for myself, and the fact that it matched the ingredients of the poison, well, it was just a bad accident." "Really?" Tracy decided to take a chance. "How do you explain your constant meetings with George? No one else has seen you two talking all the time. Were you planning something together?" George became even more nervous, his eyes darting between the detectives and Carola. It was her idea," he suddenly exclaimed, his voice breaking into a high pitch. "She planned it all. She wanted to get rid of Alice so we could be together. I didn't want to, but she made me." Carola slowly turned her head toward George, her smile disappearing. "What are you doing?" she whispered, leaning toward him. "You know that's not true." "Yes, it is." George couldn't keep quiet any longer. His fear was growing. "I slipped the medicine into her drink at dinner. I was just following Carol's instructions. I thought it was just a sedative. I didn't know she was going to die." Carola straightened up in her chair. Her face was cold, but there was a subtle shadow of anger in her eyes. "You fool," she said quietly, ignoring the detectives. Marcus and Tracy exchanged glances. "So, you're pleading guilty?" Tracy asked, keeping her voice tight. Carola turned to her, her mask falling off. "None of you would understand," she exclaimed. "Alice didn't deserve to live like this. She despised me. She despised George, and he was weak, but I helped him. I could give him what she never could, and she had to go." "You made a mistake, Carola," Marcus said, standing up slowly. "George has admitted his involvement, which means you have been exposed." Carola remained silent, but it was clear that her plan had fallen apart. She had thought of everything to the smallest detail, but she hadn't taken the human factor into account. George broke down, and with him all her ambitions collapsed. Carola and George were arrested. George, having confessed, received a reduced sentence as the perpetrator of the crime, but Carola, as the main murderer, was tried with the maximum penalty. On the day they were taken out of the courthouse, Marcus and Tracy watched. The case had proven to be much more difficult to unravel than they had initially thought, but they knew that justice had been done. "And it was all because of that medicine," Tracy said, looking at the vial that had become the main piece of evidence in the case. "They never thought it would be their sentence." "Sometimes the simplest things can be the most dangerous," Marcus added. The case was over.